Welcome to the tutorial how to export a movie. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you the different ways that you can export your scene. So before we begin, let's take a look at a few changes that I made. So the first change I made is that I changed the camera zoom in so that the camera zooms into the character at this framing. The other thing I changed is that instead of having the leg kick upwards, I just had the character shift its body position slightly as we zoom in before he starts saying his dialogue. And that's just because I think it'll make it a tidier render so that the scene that we're rendering looks a little bit more finished. So before you start exporting, you should try to consider the destination of this export. So for example, if you want to create a small video for YouTube, then obviously you would create a smaller resolution file. However, if you would like to export this scene into a third-party software or perhaps composite it into a larger body of work, obviously your considerations would then be different. So to begin, let's go to the File menu at the top and select Export Movie. And what we're looking to render here is a QuickTime movie, so a .mov. So the Export to QuickTime Movie dialog box opens. So what you can do is browse for a location on your computer as to where you would like to save this file. And in the same field, you can rename your file. So I could name this maybe QT scene for QuickTime scene. Then in the display source section, you can decide which display you would like to export. And we didn't really get into this, so let me show you that quickly. I'm just going to cancel this, go to the module library, and from our favorites tab, we can grab a display module. I'm going to drag and drop it in the network view, and I'll connect the helmet to it. And as well, let me go into my character group and drag and drop a display module into this group as well. And I will drag a wire from the composite to this display. So let's now exit the group. And then what I'm going to do is go to the Windows menu at the top and select Toolbars, Display. And we'll see here that a new drop-down menu has appeared in the top toolbar. So by connecting a display module to various elements in your scene, you can decide what you want to see. So by default, the display all will display everything that is in your scene that is enabled. So it will display everything at this moment except the helmet. If we want to isolate a single element, then we can choose one of the other displays from the drop-down menu. So the first display is just a scene display, so it'll look exactly the same. The second one, display 2, is the one that we put in our character group in here. And then display 1 is actually our helmet, and because it's disabled you can't see it. So if I select the helmet and use the keyboard shortcut A to enable, all of a sudden we see our helmet here. And if we go to the timeline and scroll across, well, first we would have to disable the camera peg and then scroll across, we'll see our animated helmet. And something you can also do, of course, is rename your displays so that they make more sense. So this could be like display helmet, so we know when we see it in this drop-down menu what we're actually looking at. That's the same for the display 2. This could be display hero, so we know we're just looking at the hero when we select this from the list. So let's go back to display all, and let's exit our group and disable the helmet one more time and re-enable the camera peg, and then go back to the file menu and select File, Export Movie. So now from the display source section, from the export from display module drop down list, we could select any of those displays, and that's what would be rendered in this movie. So for the export range, we could either export our entire films, that would be all frames, and in this case it would be 75 frames, or we could make a selection. So for example, we might only want to render frames 1 to 30. Then from the scene resolution drop-down list, you can select, half your scene resolution, a fourth of it. And this is often used to do tests because if you have a large scene, such as we do, which is 1920 by 1080, if you do a render at, say, a fourth of the scene size with all the effects composited, and say, for example, that our scene was quite long, then at least if you render at 1/4 the scene resolution for a test, it'll render much faster. So now let's click on the movie options button in the options section. And here you can choose if you want to export the video and the audio. For example, you might just want the audio, so you could unclick the video, and vice versa, you might just want video with no audio for some reason, so you could do that. You could also go into the settings for the video and change any of the parameters here, as well as the compression type, which by default is animation. And one thing that's important to note is that, say for example, we wanted to just export our character without any of the background elements. In order to ensure that there is a transparent background, from the compressor depth drop-down menu, you would have to select millions of colors plus. That plus is what gives you that alpha channel, so that there would be a transparent background and not, say, like a black or white background if you're bringing this QuickTime Movie into a third-party software to, say, composite it with other elements. So I'm going to click OK, and then OK again. And actually, let's change the export range so that we're exporting our entire film, and let's rename our movie, as that disappeared when I closed the Export to QuickTime Movie dialog box for the first time. And I'm going to name it QuickTime Movie EX for QuickTime Movie Example, and then browse to a different location as well on my computer. And let's create a new folder called Renders, so that we can easily find all the renders that we're going to create for this tutorial. And then click on the OK button. So you'll generally see a little export movie progress bar. So after the export is finished, we can go to the location where we saved our file. And then you can right-click on the .mov file and select Open With, and let's select QuickTime Player by default. And as you can see, it's quite small since we selected a fourth of the size. And then if we click on the play button,
yes? What? Let's go.
You can see a small version of our animation. Okay, so now let's take a look at another rendering option. So let's go back to File, Export, and this time let's select SWF. So in the Export to Flash Movie dialog box, we see a lot of the same options that we saw in the Export to QuickTime dialog box. So we can browse for the location of where we would like to save our movie, as well as rename the file. We can select which display we would like to render. We can select the export range. Then in the options section, we can change the frame rate as well as the JPEG quality. So the highest quality would be 100, where the lowest would be 0. You can also protect your file from being imported into another project, as well as compress your movie. However, if you do compress your movie, although you will get a lighter file size, the quality will be compromised. Then down here we have the ability to disable some of the effects. So I mentioned in the effects video tutorial that effects are bitmap based, which isn't completely true. There are some vector based effects that do exist in Harmony, and we can see a nice concise list down here. So these effects will be rendered as vector in an SWF, and that's why you have the ability to deselect them if you don't want them seen in the video. Other things to note is that pencil lines that are created in your scene will be rendered as brush strokes in an SWF. However, the auto patch, which we didn't really use, but you can use during deformation to make patches on the elbows and knees so the joints or articulations, also works in a Swift file. So I'm not going to do an actual Swift render, so what I'm going to do is click on the cancel button instead. And now let's take a look at another rendering option. So let's go back to the File menu and select Export, and this time let's select OpenGL Frames. So if you recall, Right now we're in the OpenGL mode in the camera view, and that's defined when this white flower is depressed. If we depress the blue flower instead, we're in the render mode. And in the OpenGL mode, you can't see any of the effects, whereas in the render mode, you can. You can see all those nice glows and all those soft edges for blurs. You basically see everything that you could see if you made an MOV render. So when you export OpenGL frames, what you're really doing is exporting an image sequence. In fact, you can also export a movie, but this would be the way to export a series of frames if you would like to. So once again, you can browse for the location where you would like your frame saved. Then in the format section, if you select frames, you can add a suffix to the file name. So the file name in this case will be preview, and then let's say we have 75 frames in our scene and 75 are rendered. Well, you can start at 0, 1 and go all the way to 75. However, you can also click on the drop-down list to select a larger number of digits. For example, if you know that you have something like 1,000 frames, you might want to select 0001 so that all of your files have at least 4 digits after the file name. Then if you want, you can select movie instead and click on the movie options button to bring up the same dialog box that you see when you export a QuickTime movie. This MOV, however, will not have any effects or any anti-aliasing for that matter, as it will be completely vector-based. So I'm just going to cancel that. Then we have, once again, the ability to select whichever display we would like to render, as well as the resolution of our project. And once again, we have the option of exporting, half the resolution, a fourth, to have a faster export, as well as creating a custom width and height. We can also select the frame range, that being from all of the frames, a selection of frames, just a single frame, that being the current frame, or a selection of frames, which you can also select all or unselect all, or you can click on a frame, scroll down, hold the shift button, and click on another frame, which allows you to individually render selected frames. So it's not going to export from frame 4 to 73, but it will export frames 4 and 73. And you can add more than just 2. You can also select 54, 51, etc. And those are the frames that the software will export. Okay, so let's actually export some OpenGL frames. So let's browse for a location. So let's go to that renders folder that we created and click save. And then under file name, let's name it hero underscore frames. Let's actually export some frames. We'll give them the suffix 01 since we only chose a handful. I think I may have forgotten to mention that you can also select the file type from this drop-down list, and by default it's a TGA, which is not a bad format as it supports transparency. So we'll take from the display all, or actually let's take from the display hero just to show you something different. Let's make it maybe half the resolution or a fourth just so that it's faster. And let's select a few extra frames. And so it looks like you don't actually need to hold down the shift button. You can just click anywhere in the selected frames window and it'll select some extra frames. And then let's click on the OK button. So now if we go to that same folder with the renders, you can see that the TGAs are listed here: 4, 33, 35, 51, 54, and 73. And of course there's only space for 2 digits. And you can preview those to see that there's only the hero that's visible with a black or otherwise transparent background. So let's click somewhere in the camera view and then go back to the file menu, and let's export one more time from the export OpenGL frames dialog box. But this time let's do a movie just because I'd like to show you the difference. And let's call it movie. Let's take it from the display all this time. We'll keep it at a fourth of the resolution and we'll say all frames and then click on the OK button. So let's go back to that folder again. As you can see here, here's the QuickTime movie export, and then here's our hero movie. So let's open it with the default player, the QuickTime player. And click on the play button.
Yes. What? Let's go.
And then let's compare that by once again playing the QuickTime movie export.
Yes. What? Let's go.
And I don't know if it's obvious from your perspective, but I can see a clear difference between the QuickTime movie export and the hero movie that was exported from the OpenGL Frames export window. For this MOV file, you can see that there's no anti-aliasing, so you can see that the black outlines around the character are quite jagged. Nothing looks soft. Even the effect here, you can see it a little bit, I guess if we scroll back and move this down or up, you can see that the shadow is what we would see in the OpenGL view. It's not softened, it's not blended properly. It's just vector based, but it wasn't converted into a bitmap, so it doesn't have any of that softness. Whereas if we go to the QuickTime movie export, all of those effects exist. There's a softening, there's an anti-aliasing around the black lines, and if we scroll back as well a bit, so we can see more of the character. There we go. You can see that the shadow here is actually soft and is blended properly, so it doesn't look like a dark gray, but actually looks like a dark blue when blended. So that's the difference between the two. So now let's take a look at how to create multiple renders. So just like you can add multiple display modules in the network view, you can also add multiple write modules, and not just to different elements, but you can add multiple write modules to the same composite in order to render different type of exports for the same module or scene. So let's go to the module library and let's grab a few write modules and drag and drop them in the network view. And in fact, let's also go into the hero group again and add a write module here. So I'm just going to connect the composite to this write module, click on the square, and I'm going to rename the write module based on what kind of export that I plan to create. And that's very important because if you have multiple write modules everywhere, it's best to have an indication both in the network view and then also to change the location where you're saving these exports as well as the file name. It's okay to save all of the exports in the same file folder as long as they all have different file names, because if they don't, they may otherwise overwrite one another, especially if they're the same type of export. So if I exported 3 movies to the frames folder with the file name final, by the end of the render, you'll only have 1 file instead of 3 because the last file would have overwritten the previous 2. So that's a very important thing to know. So what I'm going to do in this case is I will export a drawing, which is basically an image sequence for the hero. So let's go into the drawing folder and choose another location. So the frames folder is located in the scene folder for your harmony scene. So it's this folder right here, the frames folder. So what I'm going to do is create a new folder within that frames folder, and I'm going to call it hero image sequence and say create. So that's where the exports from this write module will go. And let's change the drawing file name to something like just the hero or something like that. Once again, you can choose the number of leading zeros. You can also choose your start frames. Let's start at 60. So what that means is that we will not start the render from frame 60, but instead the first frame in the range that we decide to render will be labeled 60. A reason that you might do this is if, for example, the scene was the second scene in your animation and you had already rendered a 59 frame image sequence from that first scene. Then in a third-party software, you would be able to import frames 1 to 59 from the first scene, followed by frames 60 to whatever from the second scene. We'll keep the drawing type as TGA, or actually let's maybe change it to something like PNG4. And now that we've created all of our settings, we can change the name of the write module. So let's name it write underscore hero underscore img for image and seq for sequence png. So it's kind of long, but it could be something like that. So write hero image sequence png, and then click on the close button. Then let's exit the group and connect these other write modules to this composite. In fact, I don't think we need to, since we're already going to have 3 examples. Let's delete one of these write modules and attach our composite to the second write module. And let's make this one a movie. So it's going to be a QuickTime movie. So let's click on the movie button here. Let's also decide where we're going to save it by going to the choose button beside the movie folder heading. And right now, once again, it's also going to be saved in the frames folder. So let's also create a new folder here, and let's call it movies, and click create and say choose. And I just realized why we see so many options here. I have both the drawing and the movie check marked, so let's uncheck the drawing. So now we have the new location of a movies folder in the frames folder for our scene. So now we can change the file name to maybe scene movie or something like that. And let's customize the movie options. So in the movie settings dialog box, let's go into, let's say maybe the size. And it says use current size, or we can change the size. So I'd like to change it to about half of what we see here, because we know that the file size is 1920 by 1080. So we could change that to 960 by 1040. So from the dimensions drop-down menu, let's select custom, and let's make it that. Let's make it 960 by 540. And let's click on the OK button and click OK again. So now here, instead of just making this the right movie, let's make it right underscore movie and put something like maybe half. So we know that this movie is half the size of the scene's native resolution. So I'm going to click close. And then for our last write module, let's also do another image sequence just for the sake of doing something different. But as you saw, you could actually render both an image sequence and a movie. You don't have to do either or, but I'm just doing either or for the sake of this example. So let's select the drawing, let's unselect movie, let's choose a different location. So in the frames folder once more, let's create a new folder. Instead of calling it movies, let's call it image sequence or image sec, and say create and choose that. Let's change the drawing file name to scene image sequence. So it shows here the start frame being 1, but let's change that to something like 70. Let's change the leading zeros to be just something like 01, and let's select JPEG this time just for the sake of choosing something different, and click on the close button. Oh, and we didn't rename. So let's click on the yellow box one more time and name this write underscore image sequence, and it's not half, it's the full resolution, so we'll just leave it as is, and then click on the close button. So in order to render what's in all of the write modules simultaneously, we have to go back to the file menu here at the top and select export render network. And once again, we also have the option of rendering all the frames or just a few frames. I'm going to say all frames, and I'm going to click on the OK button. So I sped up that rendering sequence just a little bit because, as you know, if you're doing 3 simultaneous renders, obviously it's going to take a little bit of time. So just in the interest of saving time, I sped that portion up. But let's take a look at our renders now by going back to the frames folder of our scene. And if we go to the hero image sequence, so all 75 frames of our just the hero image sequence were rendered, but were labeled as frames 60 to 134. They were rendered as PNGs with a transparent background. Then if we go to the image sequence folder, we can see that all 75 frames from our complete scene were rendered. This time they were rendered as JPEGs with the first frame label starting at 70 and going all the way to 144. And in the movie, we see our scene movie as an MOV. So everything was rendered simultaneously. And you can obviously see the advantage of that. Instead of having to render something, I mean, this is a very short scene, so it didn't take very long. But to render something obviously takes a long time. So if you have to come back after one render is finished to then do another render, it generally takes more time because you have to do things in a row instead of in tandem or simultaneously. So I'm just going to close that. And you might be wondering, why is it that I'm able to half the resolution of the render if I do a movie, but not for an image sequence? And I'm not going to get into that during this tutorial, but in the module library, under all modules, there are certain modules that you can use, such as the scale or the crop, for example. If we scroll down, you see the crop here and the scale output here. You can use modules like that between your composite and the right module to do things like scaling and cropping that you can't otherwise do in the dialog box for an image sequence all the time. I mean, you could if you render the OpenGL frames, but for example, not directly from this right module. So there are a lot of different things you can do in terms of rendering. And if you're interested in further reading about the different types of renders you could do, once again, I would refer you to the help menu and then to go to the online help and look in the compositing guide, because at the end of the compositing guide, you will see all the export options that are available. So that's it for the tutorial how to export a movie, and it's also the last video in the Harmony 11 Quick Start video tutorial series.